Well, the biggest issue these days in international cooperation is about tax cooperation. Now, the issue about tax cooperation is about how to share the tax base that is created by a company that is operating in one or two jurisdictions, right? And each country is sovereign to decide how much their tax rate is, but how to share that tax base is what is the issue. And there has been a very long effort to talk about tax cooperation in a more explicit way in which all countries are involved. And this is one of the possibilities of an international tax cooperation. By having all countries involved instead of just the OECD, many of the issues that developing countries have been unable to address will be addressed. Because in the case of the OECD, they prefer a very complicated system of sharing the tax base by allowing very complex transfer pricing rules to be the basis on which companies are able to transfer their profits from one jurisdiction to another, right? And many developing countries find these transfer pricing approaches too complex. Okay, so in 2001, there was a very large effort on the part of the IMF, especially, this is a long time ago, right? To begin talking about an international tax authority. And actually the Financing for Development conference there was a report before the conference in which the Cedillo report, which was requested by the Secretary General, supported the starting up of a international tax administration authority, which would operate more or less like the WTO, in which all countries would have some influence. Actually, there is a simpler way to move up, and that would be upgrading the UN Tax Experts Committee to an intergovernmental level. In that particular case, you will have all countries involved in the same way as all countries are involved in setting standards on statistical methods. The UN is a statistical commission, and you can have the same kind of structure in the United Nations. In the case of the UN Statistical Commission, it sets the standards for estimating GDP, balance of payments, which then become comparable across countries. The problem with the current system now is that the OECD sets all the standards, and many of the standards are irrelevant or very difficult to implement for developing countries. For example, they have come out recently with the base shifting and base erosion and profit shifting initiative, in which two of the most important topics that developing countries want to talk about in terms of tax cooperation is not actually included. One of these is the taxation of technical services, the services of financial services, management services, which in many cases are booked outside of the local affiliate, even though the services are provided in the local affiliate, and therefore they are exempt from taxes from the developing countries. The second one is on extractive industries, the taxation of extractive industries. Most developing countries are exporters of commodities, but these two particular topics could not be part of the BEPS initiative because they are not of very big interest for the tax authorities of developed countries. So what is very important is for a body, let's say the United Nations Tax Committee, to be able to handle the setting of tax standards so that the agenda can be determined, including with the influence of developing countries. It's not as if you had the UN Tax Committee that the developed countries would not be there. The OECD will continue its tax work. The OECD will continue to be very active in a UN Tax Committee. But in a UN Tax Committee, you would have all countries actually involved in setting the agenda and setting the standards, in the same way that the UN sets a lot of standards in other areas, such as in the gathering of national statistics. So this is the main point, right? There have been many arguments that have been proposed why it should not be the UN, including, for example, the fact that the UN does not have the expertise. But if you had a tax committee, in the same way like in the Statistical Commission, all countries would send their best experts, their best tax experts, to be involved in such a effort. And therefore, it is not. It's an invalid accusation that the UN does not have the expertise to undertake setting the standards for tax committee. So this is the biggest issue now, is whether developed countries will allow developing countries to have enough influence over the tax standards that are being set internationally. Sharing the tax base, as I said in the very beginning, is by its nature an intergovernmental matter. In the same way, for example, trade is an intergovernmental matter. It's a matter across governments. Trade policy are a matter across government. So should tax policies. And the main issue that where developed countries can be helped is in the question of whether they have influence over the agenda and they have influence over the methods. So in the case of BEPS, it's a very good example why two important agenda items have been left out because they are not of interest to the developed countries. It is also another example of why the methodologies are not very helpful for developing countries, and therefore developing countries cannot gain a lot of traction from what the OECD has come out with its own priorities that they have to respond to.